The Long Voyage Back, page 181. Two United States Navy ships moored to the deep-water pilings in the Turning Basin had both been disabled on the first day of the war. The larger of the two, a destroyer, looked like it had felt the effects of a not-too-distant nuclear blast. Its paint was blistered, portholes shattered, struts and rigging broken. The second, a subchaser, about two-thirds the size of the destroyer, was less visibly damaged, but it was listing to port like an old man with a bad back. Two Navy men, a petty officer and his messenger, stopped Neil at the gate. Both wore sidearms. "Captain Neil Loken reporting for duty," Neil said. The petty officer eyed him sceptically. Neil was still dressed in his jeans and boat shoes. "You have a pass, Captain?" the petty officer asked. "I've got nothing," Neil replied. "All my papers were destroyed in Washington. Let me speak to the officer of the deck." "You say you're reporting for duty?" "That's right." "Where's your regular unit?" Neil shook his head. "I'm presently unassigned," he answered. "Let me speak to your duty officer." The petty officer stared a moment longer at Neil, and then went back into a small makeshift guardhouse and spoke into a walkie-talkie. When he came out, he said to the other sentry, "Take this guy, Captain Loken, to Lieutenant Margulis." Neil was then forced to precede the guard across the open dockyard area to the boarding ladder of the subchaser, the Hague. It felt strange to be boarding a combat vessel in jeans and t-shirt rather than regulation Navy attire. The ship seemed to be in good order, and the sentry, as was proper, turned him over to the petty officer on watch, who walked Neil briskly forward. The officer of the deck, Lieutenant Margulis, was on the foredeck supervising the unloading of munitions from the large forward hatch. "What is it, Mr. Hayes?" he asked. Lieutenant Margulis, a slight, pinch-faced man, looked at Neil with distaste. "This man asked to speak to you, sir. He says he's reporting for duty." "He does, huh?" Margulis said. "Well, sailor," he went on, turning to Neil, "what's your story? Where have you been for the last 5 days?" "I'm Captain Neil Loken," Neil replied. "Annapolis, class of 1971. I just got in from sea. I want to be of service." Trying unsuccessfully to mask his surprise and uncertainty, Margulis continued to stare at Neil. "Were you on active duty when the war broke out?" he asked. "No," Neil answered. "I resigned my commission in 1975. I haven't served since." "Then what are you doing here?" the lieutenant asked with careful neutrality. "I served in CPBs in Vietnam," Neil said. "I believe I can be of more use on a combat vessel than anywhere else." Margulis frowned. "That's hardly your decision to make, is it?" he said. "Certainly we have no authorization taking men, officers, off the street." "No doubt," said Neil. "Still, I imagine this war is going to require quite a bit of improvisation." Neil could see Margulis was struggling with the paradox of having to dress a civilian in canvas shoes who claimed to be a superior officer. "I'm sorry, Mr. Loken," Margulis finally said in a cold voice. "We have no authorization to take you on here. You'll have to leave the ship." "May I have permission to speak to your captain?" "You may not. Escort this man off the ship, Mr. Hayes." Discouraged and angry, Neil was led back to the boarding ladder and off the Hague. But in the open dock area he noticed and accosted another lieutenant, and with Mr. Hayes looking on uncertainly, he explained his situation again to this officer. "The class of 71, is it?" the officer asked. He was a tired-looking, sloppily dressed man about Neil's own age, who had come from the damaged destroyer. "Yes, sir," Neil said. "If you have anyone aboard from 70, 71, or 72, they'll probably know me, or know of me." "Know of you, huh?" the lieutenant said, eyeing Neil speculatively. "Are you famous for something?" "It was a suggestion," Neil said, sidestepping the question. "I don't have my papers with me." Were half a dozen academy boys aboard this ship, but none I can think of from your time. Maybe Captain Cohen, you know him?" "No, I don't." "Then you're out of luck, I guess." "Could I see your commanding officer?" Neil persisted. "I'm afraid Commander Bonville wouldn't appreciate being disturbed by something as—" "Bonville?" Neil interrupted. "Greg Bonville?" "That's right," the lieutenant said, looking surprised. "You know him?" "I served with him for 8 months in Nam." The lieutenant hesitated. His exhausted face screwed up in a frown. "Maybe you should see him." "I'd like to." In 10 minutes Neil had been escorted aboard the destroyer Morrison. The Morrison was a mess. All its topside paint was blistering, its portholes and bridge windows shattered, bloodstains still evident, damaged weapons and debris everywhere. The petty officer who received him aboard looked sick, exhausted, or both. It took almost another 10 minutes to make contact with the duty officer and receive permission for him to see Commander Bonville. Greg Bonville had been Neil's group leader for 10 months in the South China Sea off Vietnam. He'd been a fierce, dedicated, by-the-book officer who had made Neil, for the first year in Vietnam, a believer in going by the book. 2 years later, when he'd learned that Neil planned to resign his commission, he had telephoned from Manila, where he had been stationed, to urge Neil to change his mind. As Neil was being taken to the bridge to see him again, he felt a pleasant stirring of excitement, which was sickeningly crushed the moment he saw Bonville. His friend was only 10 years older than Neil, but now he looked 20. Slumped behind his desk in his cabin, he was grey-faced and hollow-eyed. His formerly eye-catching mane of dark hair was gone. He was almost bald. Scar tissue marred his forehead and one cheek. He trembled when he stood up to greet Neil, his lanky body badly stooped. "I'm afraid I can't say welcome aboard, Neil," Greg Bonneville said. "The Morrison is a death ship." Neil stood facing his friend uncertainly. Greg's quarters were strewn with clothes, books, and papers. The ship's logbook lay on the floor, propped up against one leg of the desk. Greg sat down with a groan. "What happened?" Neil asked. "Wrong war," Greg answered gloomily, not looking up. "We were steaming south 15 miles off Cape Henry, probably 30 from Hampton Roads, when boom, we got permanently decommissioned. Did you personally get hit?" "I look it, don't I?" he replied. "I got some mild burns and cuts from the initial blast, but it was the radiation all that morning that clobbered us. The only men who might come out of all of this right are the engine room crew. Anyone who'd been out on the deck or on the bridge that night is probably not going to make it." "Including you?" Neil asked softly. "Obviously, including me." Neil turned and paced over to the shattered porthole and stared out over the waters at the turning basin towards the ocean. "Is the ship still contaminated?" Neil asked quietly. "It's pretty clean, except in the aft hold, which we closed off," he said. "They almost wouldn't let us put in here till we got their own Geiger counter man aboard and cleared us." "May I sit down?" Neil asked. "Please," Greg responded. "You make me sad standing up so straight." Neil sat down on the edge of Greg's berth. What are your orders?" he asked hesitantly. Greg looked up blankly and then snickered. "Stay here and die." "You're kidding." "Absolutely not." "The damn good orders they are. This ship is dead. The engine room crew has been transferred to The Hague. The rest of us will stay by ourselves with our little individual time bombs. Everyone can walk off in a week. Will be reassigned." "Living Jesus," Neil muttered. "Quite an end to a distinguished career." "There's nothing you can do?" Neil asked, looking up at his friend as if he was appealing for himself. "Remain on standby, and if by some miraculous stroke of luck a Soviet sub should amble up Moorhead City Inlet, go down with my ship." "I see," said Neil, getting up and walking back over to the porthole, where pieces of shattered glass were resting like a cachet of diamonds on the circular sill. "Look, Greg," he went on, turning back to his friend, who was slumped forward on his desk, staring down. "What do you know about the overall military situation?" Greg lifted his head, and the two men gazed at each other. "All I know is what I can read between the lines of the radio communications and orders." "That's something," said Neil. "What do you think?" "I think we're planning to evacuate all remaining naval personnel from the whole East Coast. I think it's rapidly becoming a war of individual initiative, just the kind we always wish we could be in." "But where's the enemy?" "Ah," said Greg, straightening up with a grimace. "That's a new twist. The enemy is in the sky, in the food chain, in the rain, in my bloodstream. And the Russians? They've shot their bolt," he said. "There's only been 2 or 3 incoming missiles since the second day. The Mediterranean and Indian Ocean fleets are gone. The population has been decimated. Whatever fighting's still going on is nothing more than the last twitching of 2 corpses. The Russians and us will probably both be fantasizing to our last breaths that we're just about to snatch victory from the jaws of mutual destruction." Neil looked at the sunken face of his friend and saw no sense of triumph. We've won?" Neil asked, feeling feeble and foolish. "If we've won, it's the way the Morrison has won." He looked dismally around the room. For a third time, Neil walked over to look out the shattered porthole. Outside he saw the Coast Guard launch begin its turn to sweep back out the channel in its systematic patrolling of the inlet. "I've been ordered to report for duty," he announced with his back still to Greg. "Here?" Greg asked, astounded. "No. To report somewhere. All men are supposed to report." "How did you end up here?" Turning around to face him, Neil gave a brief account of his voyage on Vagabond. And you're all leaving her for here? Greg asked in a low, sad voice. Neil shrugged. The law, he began. Neil, I told you, Greg said, leaning painfully back in his chair and almost glaring at Neil. This has become a war of individual initiative, and he grimaced and groaned once. And the enemy, he continued, the sole enemy, is death. And the US Navy? Neil asked softly. Greg slumped forward again. Wrong war, he replied in a low voice. After Neil had left Captain Bonneville, he searched about the infirmary and drug dispensary. There he found a sailor kneeling in front of 2 open drawers and a clutter of bottles and little cardboard cartons strewn around him on the floor. When the sailor looked up at him, Neil saw that he was stoned. He was probably searching for some sort of dope, morphine or codeine or barbiturates, judging from the dull look in his eyes. Slowly a look of bewilderment made its way into the young sailor's round face as Neil stood stiffly over him, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. All right, sailor, Neil said firmly. I don't have to ask what you're doing here, but I want you to find me any antibiotics that are still around. The small, weary-looking young man, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot, hesitated, still in confusion. I'm Captain Loken, sailor, Neil barked in a traditional manner, and I gave you an order. Aye, sir, the sailor finally replied, wobbling to his feet. Antibiotics won't work against radiation sickness. I know. Nothing works. I know. Find them. The man stared around the room and then walked over to the opposite wall and began going through the drawers. Neil came up beside him and began searching also. He found 2 vials containing liquid penicillin and a bottle labelled tetracycline with 100 capsules. He located 2 syringes in a glass cabinet. The sailor was now staring dreamily into an empty drawer. Is there still morphine available, sailor? Neil asked loudly. The man lazily shook his head and smiled. Neil made a further search for painkillers, found a small amount of codeine, and left. He decided that since weapons had been officially removed from the Morrison, his only hope was to search the petty officer's quarters. There he encountered, in 4 separate staterooms, 1 corpse, 2 dying men, and 2 men listening lugubriously to a newscast. He asked them about weapons, but they stared back at him as if he were mad, or they were stoned. In the last stateroom, empty of its occupants, he discovered in a bureau drawer a 9mm pistol, the official sidearm of the Navy, and a half-full box of ammunition. From this same room he also stole a bottle of aspirin, matches, razor blades, suntan lotion, and a small cache of cocaine. When he found himself tempted to steal Kleenex, he felt he was becoming a kleptomaniac and hastily left. Later, as he was leaving the dockyard, Neil ran into the petty officer who had originally heard his story. Well, Mr. Lokan, are you going to join us? He asked. Neil hesitated only a moment. It doesn't look that way, he replied. It appears I've been given an independent command.